Thank you, Khalida, for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure. I'm really beaming tonight, as you can see.
We've been having a lot of fun up in the green room / daycare facility that this building offers. This is such a great
half of
building.
the beaming was because of the toys, but whatever.
It was hard to leave. Well, let's just dive right in, and we're going to have time for questions after. We'll chat for a bit, and then we're going to make plenty of time for questions. So as you think of them, remember them, and we'll have you come up to a mic to ask them. So don't be shy when that time comes. So I'm going to assume that some people in the room have read the book and some people in the room have not read the book. So I think it's just really important to set the scene for your growing up in Pakistan, in tribal Pakistan, and to just share with us a little bit about what life was like growing up, and particularly what the expectations were for boys and girls and men and women in the place where you grew up.
Thank you so much. That's actually one of my favorite parts about my life and about my book, because childhood really defines a person. And I grew up extremely poor. We were living in a small village in Balochistan, part of Pakistan, so surrounded by mountains, and our houses are made of hay, cow dung, and a lot of clay. But my father took us from there to a slum community outside of Hyderabad, where we ended up going to school. The best part about poverty was that I got to have a great childhood. I played in the streets, I made my own dolls, I had everything that I wanted because I could just make it from whatever was at hand. But because of all of the deep culture that I was growing up in, I was able to see some things that a lot of my friends didn't see. Coming from a tribal and rural community in Balochistan, I was able to understand that there are tribal laws that make your life. And a lot of those laws affect women, sadly, women and girls. I was seeing how my cousins were starting to get married when I was 9 even. They would get engaged, they would get married. Every time I would go back from summer vacations, I would go back to Balochistan. A lot of my friends were gone because they were exchanged into marriages or given off. I didn't understand it at that time, but slowly it was coming to me that there is a problem where there's beauty in our culture, like there's music and colorful dresses and everything, but there are some slight things that I don't agree with because they're affecting my friends so much.
So there's a passage in the book that I feel like you should read to us because it does such a wonderful job of describing sort of your transition from childhood to womanhood. So let me have you do. I need to open to this, which means I have to put my mic down. Let's find the page here. But my question coming out of this is, at what point are you introduced to the consequences of not behaving the way that you're supposed to? I'd really love to get to that, because it sounds like it's not something that is just laid out for you one day. You know, if you do this, then this happens.
Exactly, because there's no formal ways of how old are you? When do your responsibilities start? In fact, there's no teenage life. So you don't get to have a time when you make mistakes, when it's okay to be like, because it's a phase, she's gonna be okay. That's when you're an adult. That's when you're supposed to be married and supposed to have children. And my mother was married at 9. So at the time when I'm 13, I was expected of having a lot of responsibilities that my father, I talk about this a lot in my book, is how my father helped me overcome all of that and how he stood in front of me whenever people raised their fingers or asked questions, and he was like, no, she's not gonna have that kind of life. And mind you, we're 6 sisters and 2 brothers and a huge family, 3 brothers now with an adopted brother. But he did a lot for all of us. I would love to read that passage.
Yeah, let's have you read it. And I will just comment that your dad was in an arranged marriage himself.
Yes.
And so the fact that he started to think differently about that for you and your siblings is amazing. So here we go. So this chapter is called The Overnight Adult.
The Overnight Adult. When I was 10, we moved to Karachi, where my father had taken a job as a university researcher. It was a sprawling city thronged with tens of millions of people, cars, buses, motorcycles, and donkey carts all crammed together on the small roads, while vendors sold coloring books, pens, street food, and live goats. Women in burqas, in shalwar kameez, long shirts over loose pants, the traditional outfit for both men and women, or even in jeans, strolled past beggars who stopped everyone for money in the name of God. Smoke came from cars, from the barbecue chicken tikka on the carts, and from the waste burning on the roadsides. The neighborhood of Gizri was much more congested than than any other place we'd ever lived. But somehow it felt like home. Kids played outside all day long. People spoke Brahwi. Men sat on the street corners talking with laughter and warmth. Women walked to the markets. There was a sense of community and pride. But one thing I soon discovered about Karachi was its modern conservatives. In the villages, women went to fetch water and worked in the field with men. But in the city, women and girls who lived in the lower middle class had much more restricted lives. Brothers and fathers took note of everywhere they went and what they did. They had to ask permission for everything, to visit a friend or even to walk across the street. And many times they were denied. Everything was about what would other men would say if they saw this or heard that. One afternoon, my sister Fatima, my younger brother Sajjad, and I were outside throwing a ball around, shouting and happy. At one point, Sajjad threw the ball towards me and I ran for it. But it fell near 3 men who were talking at the end of the street. The men looked absorbed in their conversation. I picked up the ball. But soon, Ammi called me inside the house. A neighbor woman had seen me pick up the ball near the men and had come over to our little house, draped in a long shawl. She introduced herself and said she'd seen me near the men. Her tone made it seem ugly and criminal. A cloud of worry came over Ammi's young face. She sat the woman down and made chai for her and told me to wash the dishes that were piled up in the corner. I frowned but picked up the water hose to fill a bucket. Water was scarcer here than in Hyderabad, and we had to use it sparingly. Later that evening, I saw Ammi talking to Abba. I was confused. Why did my mother call me in from our game? Why is today different from any other day?
Thank you. And you go on to explain why.
Yes. Basically, what happens is that the difference that I was seeing in the city life than in village life was that in city life, they did make the rules. They did say that when should girls come out, when should they not come out, what should they wear. In village life, it was all about the traditions, how they had gone out and worked in the fields with their husbands and with their brothers, and it was much more different. I understood that the little education was actually worse than having no education at all, because it made them assume that they knew everything and they could make rules based on that. Soon I found out my father actually used to take me on his bike everywhere, and it was a new city. I was my father's favorite. I'm my father's favorite still. But soon after this moment when this woman said that, there was no further discussion. A woman didn't even explain what was wrong, but my family kind of understood that it was time. I was older. And so the next thing that my father did was he asked me to not sit the way he does on his bike, but sit like a lady. And I really feel like that is the day that defined so many things for me, because the way he was saying it, he was so awkward. He was like, you can't do your legs like that. And then he called for my mother, come here. And my mother had to run and come and rescue him from this really awkward conversation, which was nothing. He just didn't want me to spread my legs. And so my mom told me that if I am gonna go and have fun with dad and have ice cream, I'm gonna have to sit like a lady. And so that was the day I became an adult. And just like that, everything changed for me. A lot of these things happen for boys as well, sadly. Of course, sadly for girls. But when they're 9 years old, even before that, boys are expected to have responsibilities towards the family. And they're told on and on that you are the man of the house. So be careful, take care of your sisters, let no one look at them. You are the man. While the brother would want to go and play outside, he keeps thinking in his heart that, oh, I have to be responsible. And that is the beginning of the person who they become later in life.
So in this position that their honor essentially it depends upon whether they do a good job of protecting the women and girls in their lives. So I think it's worth mentioning that your dad, I'd love to talk about your dad for a minute, especially since you are his favorite, and it's documented apparently. he was a huge believer in education, and in fact, he was punished with getting an education because he was a terrible goat herder. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that then became important for him, for
as
you?
you can see, we're like a legit Bollywood movie in our life. Like, we just didn't have those dances. Everything else was like that. So my father was a sheep herder. He was part of the family where all his brothers were helping his family, his father, in sharecropping. Sharecropping is where usually they work for landlords and they're given a little bit of wage every day. And so my father was 4 years old. He was the younger one, so he was given the responsibility of taking the sheep everywhere. All the neighborhood sheep, someone had one sheep, someone had two. So he would take about 12 or 13 of them with his friend, and they would go barefoot into the gardens and into the mountains near the river. And every day my father had this habit of just thinking to himself. He would think about all those things that are outside of the village. He talks to me about the first time when in the wind there was a newspaper that flew in, and he saw how like it had photos of all these different worlds on it that he hadn't seen. So he would always imagine them and always wonder when he would be able to go. Or he would think about like marble games and everything. So one time they were sitting there while the sheep was herding, and then they had lunch. Just like that, he was in his thought. It's nighttime, his friend is sleeping. And suddenly, when it's time to go back, he realizes that the sheep they're not moving. So they go and start shaking them. Turns out they overgrazed on alfalfa, so they were bloated. And turns out there was no doctor to save the sheep. And his father was so disgraced. Everyone was like, this is our only livelihood. How can your son do this? If he didn't know how to do it, why did we send our sheep with him? He's 4 years old, for God's sake. When would he learn? And so as a punishment, as a sheer act of honor to show everyone that he can punish his son, my father's father sent him to school. Because that is where sons would go if they can't provide for their family. What kind of shameful man would not be able to provide for their family, like my father, who kills sheep? So he went and he was educated. He became the first one to be educated, and he was like, I cannot believe there's this school where I'm learning about the world that I was dreaming about, and suddenly he made that his life goal.
It's your whole, you are a Bollywood movie. All the dips and turns that your world has taken. So he was promised to a young girl, or she was promised to him, and they got married when they were, both. He was 13 and she was 9.
Yeah.
Your mom, and he taught her to read.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. My father was not supposed to marry her. So turns out there's a tradition called Watasata, or exchange marriages, where if it's two different tribes, two different castes, if they don't know each other and they don't trust each other, they would exchange daughters between each other to ensure that their daughter is treated nicely in the other one. This is actually one of the best safety nets for tribal life, where there's no other rules, no other way to be like, how would my daughter be treated? So they take their daughter and be like, if you harm my daughter, I'm gonna do the same with yours. So usually marriages end up being really safe for women. But a lot of times they're also very risky. What happened with my mother's marriage was that my father's sister was asked to be married to her uncle. And so there was no other girl to exchange, and my mother was 9 years old, and she was given off to they didn't even decide who she's gonna marry. There were 3 men who were offered, and they were all like, she's ugly, she's so thin. My mother was heavily malnourished, very poor family, and so my father was forced into marrying her, and my father felt like he was really challenged, and that was the worst thing that ever happened to him until he started falling in love with her. Totally Bollywood.
So education became very important to him, and he felt like it would be important for you to also go and get an education. And my understanding is that you thought you might actually become a doctor.
Yes.
You probably would have made a great doctor, I have to say.
I wonder that sometimes.
It's never too late, I suppose. But that's not where you ended up. What ended up happening is there was something terrible that happened in your family, and you write about it in the book. And it was to do with your cousin, and that set your whole life on a different course. And so, would you share with us what happened?
Yeah. So, like I said, I was starting to be confused about how the culture is negatively affecting the women and girls, and how there is something that we are not able to understand because we are children, or it's not talked about so much. And one day, it became apparent to me that it was actually something very deep rooted. We were in the city at that time. We had actually moved to Karachi, and from that we went back to the village just like we do every other holiday, Big Eid, Small Eid, or summer vacation. And we went back, and I couldn't find one of my cousins. She was just 2 years older than me, and we play all the time, and we gossip, we talk about fun things. And I was like, wait, where is she? Silence. No one was telling me anything. I kept asking, I kept wondering what had happened, because a lot of times, either if they're married, then proudly their mothers would be like, yeah, she's married off, behind that big mountain, we gave her away, and they gave us this much money in return, in any case. So a lot of times, the other thing that happens is someone is very ill, and there's a tradition called dakrak, where you put the patient, in a room for 40 days, and no one goes to visit them. So I thought maybe she was very sick, but no one was talking about her, and that is what worried me. Until that late night, I was still on the cot. We were 3 girls sleeping on that cot, which is a wooden bed, and near us was the charpoi, the cot for little children. And so I kept asking my cousins, and they were like, you want to talk about something else? They would bring up some other things. And then one of the child from the other bed, she just stuck her head out of the blanket, and she moved towards me, and she whispered, they killed her. Our uncle killed her because she did something wrong. And that was it. I believed it, because we don't joke about these things in our culture, in our tribe. And that's when I found out that my cousin was murdered by my eldest uncle because she had fallen in love in the name of honor, to restore the family's honor. And that's how deep, that's how far honor can go in defending the pride of the family, that you can actually kill the daughter you've raised on your own.
So, I mean, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine. I mean, one of the questions that I had is, back to this, how much did you understand, and how much did she understand about what the risks were of going outside of what her family's expectations were for her? And how much, I mean, do you have any ideas about what was in her mind?
Sadly, I do. I talk about that in the book, because I was too young to understand it. She came to me with that thought, with something that could have indicated that she was going to be in trouble, and I might have done something, but I was too little to understand. And now when I look back, I'm horrified of what could have happened. I think a lot of the pain that stayed with me throughout all these years was because of that moment. So I was going to school, but at the same time I was sent to a mosque to learn about Islam and about how to be a good Muslim. And I learned that Islam is what makes you a good person. Islam requires you to be a good person, to be a good Muslim. We learned about lying, we learned about things that would make you bad, that would define the worst in you. And so the one time I learned that we had female tutors, so they would say that when you are feeling evil, when you're feeling anger or hatred towards someone, or you're lying, that's not you. That's shaitan, that's the evil of God that's coming over you and taking over your personality. And so in that moment, you have to recite this prayer that would take away shaitan from your head. And so we were like, oh my God, that's fantastic, because there are times when I want to hurt my friend, she makes me so mad, so I'm going to pray this thing and it's going to be fine. So I started telling everyone in the village about that prayer. I'm like, this is a magic prayer. You would become a good person if you pray. Soon, women found out in our Haveli, in our house, and they told me that no, your tutor was wrong. You're actually supposed to pray that when you see a boy, when you think that you think that boy looks nice or he's a good person. Just any feelings about boy, you pray that so that shaitan goes away from you. And that was the first time we were told that falling in love is a very, very horrifying sin.
And so your cousin came to you and said, what is that prayer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Soon after that, I was playing with my friends, and she was praying as well in the other room. And this room where I was in became empty, and she walked up to me, and she whispered, "Hey, what was the prayer that they told you when evil comes on your head? Because I need it." And I told her the prayer, and soon after that, she was murdered.
But you couldn't possibly have known, first of all, and how do you know that you would have been able to change her mind? You don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah. So that, I mean, the question of honor and what the family decided to do in her case, I mean, that's something I know that you want to change. And you've done quite a bit to get there. But I think before we even talk about the kinds of things that you've done to try and change people's hearts and minds, I think we should talk about honor and the meaning of honor and how there's a light side and a dark side to it. So we do have another passage in your book that I know you like to read. So
That's
I'm gonna
my favorite part, actually. So I would absolutely love to.
I'm your page turner. Here we go.
Introduction. There's a saying in my tribe, Izzat mare, pen mare te maf. Even if I have nothing, I should have honor. Like any other girl in my village, I associated the concept of honor and dishonor with my father. I knew in the way that I knew the sun rises from the east, that as his eldest daughter, I was the person who could dishonor him the most. In my childhood, I would spend days and hours worrying about how to keep the honor of my father alive and how never to stain it. Every time I thought of honor, a small girl would come to mind, a girl wearing a long chadar, veil, standing behind the weather-beaten wooden door of her house, peeking through the cracks, staring at me while I played with my friends in the street. She would be one of the girls in the village who wasn't allowed to play with me and my friends as we ran around yelling at one another, playing hide and seek, or making clay dolls. She was each of those girls who stayed behind, peeking from the windows and doors when I went to call them to play. There were moments in our game of when I would steal a glimpse of these girls and feel a stab of jealousy in my heart for how strong they must be to stay behind at home and honor their fathers. I wished I could do that, or I wished I were forced to do that. But instead, games, clay dolls, and experiences running free were my reality. At times, I would see my cousins run off, their faces flushed, hiding smiles, the corners of their scarves stuffed in their mouth each time their mother spoke about their marriages. "Look at the honor of my house," the mother would beam. "Shy as a little kitten." The jealousy would return. I would never feel so shy, perhaps. I'm definitely going to dishonor my father. I would think to myself with a sinking heart. As I grew older, my innocent understanding of honor and dishonor expanded through hushed whispers of the women in our Haveli. As the word murder emerged in the same conversation as honor, my fear and anxiety about this topic became stronger. Women and girls killed because they brought shame on their male relatives and their houses. The biggest dishonor to a house, it seemed, was a girl gone wrong. Never really understanding what that meant, I had promised myself that I would never go wrong. Then one day, when I was about 10 years old, my father sat me down and asked me the question I dreaded the most. "Khali," he said in a tone that made no effort to hide his affection and worry, "do you know how you will dishonor me?" Blood drained from my round cheeks. My mouth became dry and I felt lightheaded and heavy in my body at the same time. I didn't say anything understanding very well that he knew the answer to his question. He knew clearly but wanted to hear it from me. I did not want to say it aloud. The idea of going wrong was a bitter taste in my mouth, a devil lurking in the woods, a ghost hiding behind doors, all those things I feared, and yet I didn't even know what wrong meant. So I kept quiet, letting the thick air hold me still as my breathing turned shallow. My father's eyes looked straight into mine. Fear now took physical shape and danced in front of my eyes as I stared back at him, afraid that he could see it too. Khali, he continued with the same grimness. You will dishonor me the day you fail to bring good grades home. I thought I was not hearing him correctly. I have risked every bit of my dignity by bringing you and your sisters to the city, he continued. I've brought tears into my own father's eyes. I've argued with my friends about my decision to give you freedom, and with this freedom, they tell me you can easily destroy my honor. My honor now lies with you, my Khali, and the day you stop working hard and fail in school, I will be completely dishonored. He kept speaking, but I wasn't able to hear anything else. My universe was slowly taking a new shape around me. My mind and heart filled with fresh awareness, and my brain opened with the burst of this new knowledge.
I mean, no pressure. So let's talk about this honor and honor killings. I mean, where do those come from, and why do the men who commit them get off? They don't. There are laws that actually enable them to murder members of their family and not serve any consequences.
I mean, laws definitely make them feel good about it, because I've seen both ways. I've seen people who kill and not go to jail, and I've seen people who kill and go to jail. Both times they were celebrated. So there is no difference. The time that it starts is when honor becomes important, and it is important. I come from a country where honor is the most important thing to anyone, because a lot of the people who live in the villages and tribal communities, they literally have nothing. They have no food, they have no schooling for their children, they have no electricity, nothing, but they have honor. So they keep their honor, they keep their dignity close to their hearts. And that's how I've grown up in these communities, knowing that no matter what happens, I have to keep my dignity close to my heart. But how far do you go in that dignity? How far do you go in preserving that dignity and honor is where it has gone wrong. Because the first time when my mother was decided to be married off, it happened in few seconds. She was 9 years old. You would read about her, and it's so magical. Her childhood was so beautiful. She had such a wonder about her. She thought that she was going to live her life like that. While she was playing on top of a tree, picking fruits and everything, her father was saying to his brothers that it's my honor to give you any of my daughters, pick one. So he, just like that, he was deciding, because he wanted to be the honorable man, the honorable brother. And that's where it becomes a problem. A lot of the murders happen because they want to show that I am so honorable that I would go as far as to kill my own daughter to keep the honor of my family. And if they don't, there are consequences as well. I have written a lot about, it's such a complex issue that I tried so hard to bring it together in a small book like this, but honor has become a very complex thing on itself. It builds the society and then it breaks it as well. And we are in between in Pakistan. In fact, like I was saying earlier, that this country was built on honor. A lot of the countries that become like the way they are usually because they chose honor before they chose anything else.
And you're talking about the United States when you say
Yes,
this country.
This country, yeah. So that's honor, and that's what leads men to do that to their daughters.
So where to begin? How would you like to redefine honor? I mean, when you go and talk to people about what honor can mean, as opposed to what it may currently mean, What kinds of things do you talk about?
It became really easy for us the first time when we started reading the Holy Quran properly. It's very amazing, but I was very naive about my own religion because we read it in Arabic and we don't understand majority of it. My husband is American. Long story. Another Bollywood movie.
There's a Greyhound bus involved. And boots.
But when he first started reading the Holy Quran and it was in English, I would read with him and I'm astonished to find out what is written in there. All these things that we are kept away from. And it makes it so much easier when we take those evidences and go to the men and say, if this is how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, lived his life, then what kind of Muslims are you? When you challenge them based on their religion, they listen. And when they listen, you actually come up with solutions together. That's what we've done through the 10 years that took us to find the strategy that really works in these villages. We found out that at the end of the day, the misuse was religion, and we are going to have to use religion to change all of that, and that's what we do.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I know that where you started was with the women and trying to gather the women and get a groundswell of enthusiasm for this new way of thinking. So can you talk a little bit about what happened when you tried to do that?
So we're in the very, very beginning.
Very beginning, gathering of the women.
Yeah, I love talking about when I first started because I was 16 years old, a great age to be extremely angry. You get anything done. Seriously. And because of that anger, I was really motivated. And because of that motivation, I was able to get a lot of people convinced, especially my grandmother. The whole thing starts with my grandmother, the indigenous woman who was married at 11 years of age, who is extremely traditional in her ways. And she lives in a small village in Balochistan still, a very beautiful life. The first thing I told her was like, grandmother, you're going to come with me to all these houses. We're going to talk to women. She's like, why? I'm like, women need the support. There's need to be women empowerment. And then with her, all my other aunts, why? And so it became a really long conversation to convince her, to make her believe that it was in fact important. This brings me to another really good story, which actually shapes every single day of my life, is when my father gave me his first advice. So because I was seeing a lot of these things when I was growing up, I was crying so much. I still cry a lot. It helped me a lot. I would run home. My cousin had been married. I would run home and put a pillow on my face and just sob. I would wait for everyone to go to bed, and I would weep through the night. There were times when I would hide behind a curtain and I would cry. Anytime something would happen, I would run home. And so my father started noticing. One time, my friend didn't come to the school because she had her periods and they decided her marriage. Just at that trace, the decisions start actually, the proposals start coming in. And so I ran home and my father caught me. And he said, shh, shh, my daughter, don't cry, strategize. And I was too young to be like, what do you mean? I need to cry right now because this is extremely sad. And then he kept doing that. Every time he found me crying, he kept saying strategize, and it stuck with me. When I started my journey, I knew that without strategy, we were not going to be able to fight something so old, something so harsh. And so that day, that moment when I was talking to my grandmother and they were like, what do you mean they need help? I had to strategize. So the first strategy in that moment was I told them that inflation is a very big problem in Balochistan, and we've had a lot of droughts. And Balochistan is a very dry area, and we've had a lot of droughts, and because of that, people are suffering. But because of that drought, because of not having livelihood options, people were actually very happy to send their girls to offices to look for jobs, but these girls were never trained because they were never allowed previously. And so here I am, a 16-year-old, telling my grandmother that if she comes with me, we would be able to train these women and get them jobs, and I had no idea how we were going to do it, but she came. And that's how we started.
So then one day you went to a village, and I don't know the sequence of events or how many of these gatherings you held before this happened, but I do recall the story in your book that you were met with men and axes in one village.
That's much later.
Okay. Might that have been a question mark for you about how you were approaching the situation?
Yeah, so the thing is, we can never stop at one strategy. Even before talking to my grandmother, I thought that the main strategy was to fight the policies, because policies that support something like this have to be changed, and we are just not anything close to being able to do anything until the government does. So we tried to push the government in doing many things, and it didn't work, and that's what led us to work with the tribal communities. I tried many, many different things, and every time it was one strategy after another. I started in 2005, and it's now 2018, and the strategy finally has started working. I mean, there were times when I would get anxiety attacks because it is not working. The only thing that kept us going was knowing that it's a behavioral difference. When you're working with people's mindsets, it's gonna take a long time. It's gonna take so long, and you're never gonna see it. It's actually gonna be small traces of change in the society that would become visible, and that would be your result. So all these strategies that we were trying, we had to come up with new ones eventually. If you want, I can talk about a few of them.
Yeah, please.
If you have time.
Yes, do it.
So in the beginning, we thought, like any other angry young person would think, that policies matter, and so we have to fight them, we have to change the policies. It did not work, because, so what happens in tribal communities is policies are here, my family is here, my community is here. They're not affected by the policies, the constitution, or anything, because they have their own laws. My uncle is a tribal leader. My maternal uncle, eldest uncle, he makes decisions about the village life and about who should marry whom, about what should happen and everything. And if that is how local we are, we don't listen to what happens at the police department. So eventually, after 2 years of fighting really hard, being on the streets, even doing hunger strikes, and pressing the government to bring the Women Protection Bill that actually came out in 2006, we ended up convincing a lot of the policymakers to join us, but none of that was affecting our people. So eventually we decided that we are going to go back and we are going to work with these communities. But when we started working with the communities, the problem that came was that I was still young, I was working with young people, and I was bringing them in groups, I was teaching them, giving them all these trainings, and I hired a lot of tutors that taught them how to use computers and stuff. It became a Western thing. The word that started spreading is that you're westernizing our traditions. You're bringing un-Islamic culture into this community. So another setback came, and we had to do something about it. This time it was really big that I ended up making my own people angry. So my father took me away from there back into Karachi. But in that moment, that was the first time when I was actually locked up, because my father was like, you have to finish your 9th grade. You can't just keep going back and doing all these things. You have your school. In that moment, when I was finally at home without any resources, he took my phone. My father was receiving a lot of threats from the community. He was the one who wouldn't tell me what kind of things people were telling him, but I was just in my own space. He said that if I finish my school, I would be able to continue it. But the whole time I kept thinking that what were the mistakes that led us to this thing. In 6 months, I was able to realize that there were 3 huge mistakes. Number 1, we were disrespecting everyone. I was disrespecting myself. I love this culture. How can I go in the streets and shout against this culture when I believe in it every day and I wear it every day? The second thing was, we were not making the people who are actually the ones we are fighting for, the women we are fighting for, not part of this journey. They had no idea. They were washing dishes in the houses while we were in the streets shouting for them, or we were training other young people. The third thing that was happening is that we were not looking at what is it that keeps these dangerous crimes alive, that are called a name of, that are called part of tradition, but they're not. So we discovered that the reason that these things are alive are also very common. Number 1, because policies don't support women. Number 2, because men treat their women wrong. But the third thing that we found out was what changed everything. We found out that it's because women believe that they should be treated like this. I remembered so many memories. I am very grateful to God. I'm actually extremely grateful to God for one thing, that is my memory. Every memory that happened in my whole life, it stayed with me like a story. I loved telling stories from childhood. I kept them like stories. I would tell them to people. And I remembered all these different moments in my life where mom would be nudging me to put my scarf because men were looking at me. And I would be like, but why isn't he looking away? And why do I have to wear the scarf? And she would be like, it's our thing, you know, women have to do it. Now come wear the scarf. And I would wonder, what is, you know, there's something wrong in here. One of the biggest moments that that came back to me in 2009 when we were trying to find out how these issues are so prevalent was remembering my aunt. When I was a child, I remember my aunt came to visit. And we were all in the house, everyone lives together. And she was married off and had children, but one day she came back and her children were with her. And she was wearing a long burqa, but her face was visible, and there were so many spots on her face. There were so many bruises. And then all the women rushed to her. They took the children from her, gave her water, and her mother was like, what happened? And she said very normally, very casually, while I'm playing with the kids in the corner, I was looking at them, listening to everything. Children always listen. We think they're not listening, they're always listening. So,
I'm aware of that. having experienced
be
that
careful.
myself. Yes.
So her mother's like, what happened? And she said, my husband beat me with the broom. And her mother, the most important thing was what her mother said. She's like, see, if only you feed him, if only you take care of him nicely, he wouldn't do these things to you. And that is what came back to me, and I knew that the problem is women, sadly. It is women who believe it is their fate to receive these issues. It is their fate to say yes. It is their fate to actually keep quiet. If sexual harassment happens to them, if problems occur to them, they wouldn't say because it's going to become a big issue. It's going to stir problems. It's going to bring their dirty laundry in the streets. It's going to do so much damage. Women think about all these problems, and that is why we had to work with women. And the strategy that is today leads going back to the women, working directly with the tribal communities, making a center where women are trained for 6 months and given grants to launch their own businesses and become skilled, confident, and business women inside the tribal areas.
That is so amazing. Yeah, I mean, what? Yeah, I'm waiting. Where's the applause?
Stop.
But that's also, I mean, one of the things that I've been talking a lot about lately is empowerment, and which empowerment is really effective and actually leads to a sense of power and real power. And so having those skills is a way of empowering, but also a mindset shift is a way of empowering women and men. And it sounds like that's really something that you're working towards changing is minds, but
Exactly.
but the incremental change is too slow.
All of it is too slow, actually. It takes us 3 years to work in one village where we train 30 women per year. And while there's so many women who are suffering, so many women who need our help, you see, like any other activist, young activist, I would say, my first thought was that numbers matter, and I have to go to as many women as possible, as many villages as possible. We were receiving funding from UN, and we were spreading very quickly, 300 women every year. We were like doing as much as possible. But at the end of the day, it was never effective. I never remembered anyone's names. I never knew whose story was what. What is happening now, why it is effective, is because every woman, we know them. Every woman we are serving, we are able to give them grants. We're able to follow up on their trainings, because without following up, without giving them the resources to become skilled, to become empowered, we cannot do anything for them. So after every 6 months, they receive these grants and they launch businesses, and they still receive support from our team to continue to see if they're doing great, if they're able to grow their businesses, and where do they grow from there.
And what is the role of the men in making real change happen? I mean, I know that if you empower all of these women, but the men aren't thinking differently, then it's it's going to be hard to make a real difference. So what are the kinds of things? I mean, you talked about reinterpreting what their religion is saying, and getting them to think differently about that, and using what's important to them. And kind of shifting their way of thinking about it. But what are some of the other things? I mean, can you get really specific? Like, no, it's not okay to hit your wife with a broom. I mean, how far can you go in those conversations?
One of the biggest tactics that helped me in any of my work throughout all these years is my diplomacy. I had to learn from a very young age, even talking to my father, that I had to be diplomatic. Otherwise, I won't get anything done. Not only strategizing every point of the way, but also understanding that you cannot disrespect. The first thing that you have to do is use what they're valuing, appreciate that, and then turn it to show them what is wrong. And a very easy form of this is like when you want to show people that they're using a dirty glass, you want to tell them you should just show them a clean glass so they know what it looks like, and they make a decision about it themselves. What we do for the men is we tell them what real Muslim means, what being a good Muslim means, and then they're able to see it themselves. It's such a slow process that we have to wait for a long time for it to come into the society, but 3 years is enough for us to see the traces. So we have two main activities for the men, which is my favorite. One of them is cricket matches. So any change you want to make in Pakistan, bring on the cricket matches. I see some Pakistanis here, I think they would understand, right? Yeah, exactly. Cricket matches work. So we started with this because we saw these tribal men, big beards, really conservative, but they would not even blink when they're watching a match. They would be like, I know he's gonna win. I'm telling you, Shahid Afridi is doing it. And then so we decided that we're gonna bring two great teams together, and we are gonna do a great tournament where we would give awards and everything, and we are gonna text all the men. We initially, in the beginning of the village assessments, we collect their phone numbers. So we're gonna text them, we're gonna use radio, and we're gonna use every kind of communication to bring these men to this match. And there's a lot of preparation to it. On the day of the match, all these men are gathered in this ground, open field, where they're sitting and watching. The two teams are playing. In between a cricket match, there's a part when you can't breathe, because it's so interesting. And in that moment, when our team member is doing the commentary, he's like, yeah, that's a 4, and now that's a 6. Wow, they're doing great. And now let's talk about women's rights in Islam. And
really?
Yeah.
And do the guys like smoke a cigarette, or are they actually paying attention?
It comes very slowly, and then it comes, like they stop, okay? It's like as if they didn't hear it, and then it comes again. The thing is, these issues are taboo. These problems are taboo. You cannot bring up a conversation about your wife into markets. This is a very different kind of world where if you say something about a woman in the market where all the men are, then it's like everyone thinks that something is wrong. That's how most of the murders happen. Like, hey, I saw your wife going to this neighbor's house, and they're like, oh my God, this guy saw my wife, whatever. It becomes a big deal. But when they hear these things, when they hear that Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually raised his daughter to play games with her, and because his daughter loved to run, he would play all these fun games with her. And then the next day in the markets, when they're sharing a chai, which is very common, you would see someone and ask them to come have chai with them. And then you'll be like, hey, did you hear that? Did you hear that yesterday when they were saying, Muhammad, what a nice thing, huh? Our prophet was just amazing. Slowly, they're talking about women in public. Slowly, they're starting conversation about their wives, their daughters. Yeah, I send my daughter to school. Yeah, I'm a good Muslim. Slowly, it becomes such a thing that if it's breaking the taboo, it's actually becoming part of the society. The second thing we do actually kind of builds on that. So every month we do a monthly meeting. In the beginning, this was just for the women because we were very scared to bring the men and see what their views on our project. So now we bring the men, and we ask the men, first the women update us about what's happening in the center and what they've been learning and who's started businesses and everything. But the other thing is we ask the men if there's any of the men who's done something nice for their wife or their daughter, like anything. The first time we did this, I remember, we asked this, no one. Everyone's like sitting there being like, see, whoever is dishonorable would stand. Well, finally, there was a dishonorable man who stood, and he's like, my wife was very sick, and I took her to the hospital on my bike. And we're like, oh my God, what a great man. Everybody should clap for him. We made him feel like the king of this world. Next month, men actually did something for their wife so they can talk about it in the meeting. Breaking taboos is very important. It's very important because you cannot start with harshness. If If my father, when I wanted to go and see my friends, if he like held me by the arm and threw me in the room and said, you can't go, instead of that awkward conversation he had with me about sitting differently on the bike, if he had been extreme, I wouldn't have been the person that I have become. Starting very slow, changing mindsets very simply, that's what helps.
Those are amazing approaches. Well, this is a conversation that I think, it's different here in the U.S. To the extent that we, can freely talk about women in public, whether we're male or female. But we are having, a national conversation about how women are treated and ways that we can do things differently and ways that we can get to equality. I mean, that's the goal. So looking around at what's happening here, because you live here now, and I'm sure you're seeing, all this happening with the Me Too movement and so on. Would you say that any of the things that you've learned through your work, specifically with regard to honor killings and changing mindsets about women in Pakistan, would apply here in the U.S.? Things that we could be thinking about in our situations here.
Definitely. I think what helps me most is that the detachment from my culture, the lack of detachment, I should say. As you can see, my English is still not as good. But I have kept my ground, and that comes from my tribe. I have learned to live exactly as we lived in Pakistan. And going back and forth, then taking my husband really helps a lot. But that allows me to see the difference so much more. Like I was saying to you or Charlene, is that it's very disorienting when you go back about every 2 months and you're like, I cannot believe how different these two worlds are. But yes, they do apply. What happens is that, so over here, women have come very far. They've come very far. They have the freedom, they have the skills, they have the opportunities to grow and everything. But there's one thing that I'm seeing in the feminist movement that I'm very vocal about, is that how women, in trying to fight for their own rights, actually tend to become like men. If you're fighting to be equal to men or above them, you can't be like them. That means they win. You can't try and look like them. You can't try and do the things that they do. Just do your thing in the most feminine way possible and show it to the world that a woman can actually be empowered as well. And I think that's where my only problem lies. Otherwise, it's really wonderful where we are going here.
Well, that is so much baked into our culture, is that to get ahead in business and in the world, you have to act like a man. And there's so much to be said for acting like a woman.
Like sitting back and being like, see, we win at the end of the day still.
That's right. We're still in comparison. But I think just with the last election, just to use that as an example, the midterms, so many women were getting together to write postcards and to march and to protest and to knock on doors. And there were a handful of guys, at least in my personal experience at the gatherings that I attended, but it was mostly driven by women. And I just kept having this feeling like if the men would also join us, a lot would happen a lot more quickly.
Exactly.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, separation is never going to do anything. We tried that in these 10 years of finding the right strategy. We actually tried to have a complete separate movement of women as well. It's not like I didn't think like that. I wanted the women to think differently and raise much higher than men. They couldn't do anything. They were able to learn about their rights, but what they wanted to do at the end of the day is run away from their home and divorce their husbands, and that's not the kind of society we were trying to bring. So we had to work with both of them.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, is it about rewarding those men that do step up? I've been given a hard time for saying thank you to men for showing up because they should just show up. But it seems like, saying thanks is kind of a good idea.
Exactly. Well, I'm really grateful for all the men who came here today. Usually my husband is the only man in the room. He comes with me on many of my trips. But it's really, really amazing to see men gather at important events like this.
Well, let's give a little bit of attention to some of the social enterprises that you're running. You've got this really cool spot called the Chai Spot, and you've got the Sugar Foundation, and you've got a hospitality business. So let's just give a little plug to all the things that you're involved in, and I don't know how you make the time.
Don't do it. Don't do it. It's not inspiring to be doing a lot of things at one time. I'm like the least inspiring person to young people right now because it's pretty overwhelming to be running a lot of things at one point. But the chai spot is actually my second favorite thing that we are doing. What happened is when my husband and I got married, which is a long story how we convinced our families, we literally had to trick them into meeting each other, and that is in the book, like the love story. But that was the first love marriage after my cousin's murder, so it was extremely hard to actually say that, yes, I am in love, but his name is David. So So after that, when we did end up getting married in Pakistan, a 10-day-long wedding, henna nights, dances, lots of food and everything, we came to America and we had a planned wedding, a destination wedding in Sedona, Arizona. And everything was all set. His family was going to come, his friends. We had foreigners come to Pakistan as well, but a huge network of my people were still in the US that were coming. 1 month before the wedding, we canceled the wedding, just like a Pakistani would do. We were like, you know what? A lot of people had bought their tickets. We decided that we would cancel the wedding and use that money in launching a business that would celebrate our love and our story every single day by bringing Pakistan to America. We had to do it because we were seeing a lot of people be amazed at him for marrying me, amazed at me for marrying him. And so that is what led us to do that. So we used our wedding money, and we had no idea it blew up. It's in Sedona, Arizona, the first location. It's this magical spot where you walk in and you see Pakistan, the first thing. All the products are made by women, and then you are able to buy chai and experience the hospitality of Pakistan. And recently we took that to New York. We made a second location, and unbelievably, New York just took us in and welcomed us with so much love that this location is doing unbelievably amazing. We are in Manhattan on Mott Street. I'm very naive about New York still. It's just been a month, but it's doing really, really amazing.
Mott Street's where all the cool boutique stores are, right?
I Google about how to look cool every day.
You're doing a great job. Well, get your questions ready because we're going to wrap up our conversation and invite you up to the microphone, which will be placed right over there. So if you have questions and you want to start forming a line, you're welcome to do that. Don't be shy. I know you have questions.
Bring on your hardest ones.
I know. Maybe I didn't ask enough hard questions. What?
Because I'm giggling the whole time? Is that?
I just bring that out in people. I don't know what to say, even the really tough stuff. Well, you know what? Can you just tell how you and your husband met? I just think it's the sweetest story.
That's the hardest question ever. I mean, I wouldn't destroy the book for people. But it was a very random meeting. We basically met in a park because someone told me, I was in LA, and someone told me that in LA people take care of their health. They drink kale, soup, whatever, what is that? Smoothies. And they drink green tea, and they go running every morning. And so she had me go running with sneakers in my tribal dress. So I met him looking like a penguin, and that's how it all started.
You really
Rest
have to.
is in the book.
Yeah, you really have to read the book. Well, let me ask you for your best advice. What is the best advice that you've ever been given about how to make change when you feel that something just isn't right?
I mean, I talked about my first and favorite advice by my father about don't cry, strategize. The second one, I am a big believer in Rumi, the Sufi poet, and I read him and I follow him religiously, and I found out one of his most wonderful poems when I was starting. So it helped me, and it goes like this: destroy your, I'm so bad at this. Destroy your fear, run from what makes you feel comfortable, be notorious. I've tried prudent planning for long enough. From now on, I will be mad. So be mad, be crazy, be shameless about what you're doing, but do it gracefully. Never, ever disrespect anyone, and so much will happen because of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Khalida. So do we have a
so
question? Oh, is everyone being shy? Do we want to just hand the microphone into the
I
audience?
think that
don't
would
know
help,
is that
right?
possible? No? You have to stand up if you have a question.
Come on, you guys. I really thought. Okay.
Be brave. What did you say? Destroy your fear?
Yeah, destroy your fear. Live where you fear to live. I mean, find it. I've totally broken it, but it's such a beautiful poem.
I had to come a little late, but did you mention anything about mullahs? Did you try to go through the mullahs? Because I think if the mullah in the mosque gave a speech about it's wrong to beat your wife, it's wrong to have your kid married at whatever.
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, we learned very quickly that who was in charge in the villages. So we had to go to the people who had more control to be able to access the tribal communities, to be able to access the women. And we found out that there are 3 people who actually have a say in the decision-making of the village. Number 1 is the tribal leader. Number 2 is either the religious leader, mullah, or the school teacher, if there is a school. And number 3 is a midwife. So these 3 people were what we had to go through very strategically, doing small meetings with them, going back to them again, going to the mullah again, befriending him, and then starting our work. Getting the mullah on our side in the very beginning helped us open the Holy Quran with him and showing him without disrespecting him, because he would a lot of times miss what he's telling the people. And when you give them evidence, when you remind them that if you are a true religious leader, you would talk about the real truth, and then we would go into the village, if that makes sense.
Yeah, when I was driving you here, which was so much fun, we were talking about how when someone would come up to you and say, "How are you?" You would just like, in Pakistan, we really say how we are fully and tell the story of our lives and, what's on your heart. And, whereas here it's just this sort of casual, "How are you?" "Oh, I'm fine. How are you?" So if I were to ask you, "How are you?" Like, what would you say is on your heart? I mean, of what you're doing, of what matters most, how are you deeply?
Wow. Wow, that's a very good question. I've not been asked that. I usually ask people that. I think I would say I'm really full. I have never felt this full before. I have been given so much in my life that it's sometimes very disorienting to know where I've come from and who I have become. The other day, actually 3 nights ago, my husband and I were cleaning our house, and what happens is we have a lot of guests come in, and sometimes they would leave something and they would forget something, and I found these small bottles, and that looked like there was just water in them, or it was a perfume or something. I opened it, and it was a bubble maker. And so I blew on it, and the whole house filled with bubbles. And I cried. I sat there on the floor, and I cried so hard because I wanted a bubble maker when I was little. I really wanted a bubble maker. I tried to make one. I tried so hard to make one, and it never worked. We never had good soaps. That's the whole problem. But to know that, to remember my ground and where I come from, and to know that my 9 siblings are back home, and all my life is back home, it makes me feel very grounded. I appreciate the feeling of fullness, but I also long for the feeling when I was empty and I had nothing. So wherever I go, I strive to give as much as possible of this fullness and make myself empty again. But it's all the love. Everywhere I go, I receive so much love that I can't be empty at all.
I think we have another question.
I'm curious about your sisters. You mentioned you have all these sisters, and how many of them if any of them have followed your footsteps or gone the completely opposite direction and leading a more conservative lifestyle in Pakistan?
I think I'm the most conservative of all of them. They joke about that a lot. My sister's like, if I was in New York, you would see me in the best brands of jeans and everything. I wouldn't be like that. I think I kept my dressing because it's just my values, and I've stuck to some of the things that I would never change. But my sisters are doing amazing. One of them is a fashion designer. One of them is a national trainer. One of them is, I never understand what she's doing, but she makes these masks and all these things that she's trying to sell online. One of them wants to be Hannah Montana. And, and one of them wants to ditch everyone and go and live in Australia for no good reason, and she's 10. And my older brother is a filmmaker, and my other brother is just graduated from a really great university called Zabist, started by Benazir Bhutto, one of our really amazing leaders. So my family learned to work really hard, and it all came from my mother and father. This actually brings me to this moment that when I sent my book hasn't come to Pakistan. It hasn't, and I would love for it to come to Pakistan. There are some complications, there are a few risks, but I am ready for it to be everywhere. But when I sent to my father a copy, I was like, what should I write on it? Nothing would be as big as like this moment when he opens it. And so I wrote something that nagged on my heart all my life. I wrote that there were times when I was going to school. We were living in a small house that would fill with gutter water every time monsoons would come. It was a very tiny one-room house. All of our 9 siblings would sleep on the floor. And we had a second-hand computer. That's the computer I mentioned about working, which I was allowed to use for 10 minutes. But I would wake up in the middle of the night, and I would see my father like this on the old computer, typing and keeping his eyes open, trying really hard to keep his eyes open. He worked 3 jobs to give us education. And I wrote to him that in that moment, each time I woke up and I saw him, I used to think in my heart that, Dad, you have no idea. Because I would never know. I would never know how to repay you for this moment when you're so sleepy. And I still wonder that to this day. And that's what he taught us, to work really hard, no matter how tired you are. Everywhere I go, I speak to the young people in universities, and they've heard about working smart. And I have to remind them that no, it is also about working hard. It is also about breaking your bones, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to help you. Thank you.
What has your dad's reaction been to the book?
They made a video of him. I instructed them. He put on a really good show. He was like, that's what he's doing in the whole video, and that's it, until my sister was tired of filming. But what I really found out was when I Skyped my mom one time, and I was talking with her, and this was just a voice Skype. I wasn't seeing her, and then my father came to her and found out that she's talking to me, and he took the phone and he's like, Khali, you have to bring your book to Pakistan. It's about time we tell everyone. And I'm like, oh my God.
So he just didn't like being videotaped. He had more to say.
I think he is so afraid. You see, the problem that has happened with my father is that he's experimented. His whole life has been an experiment. Growing children, growing a daughter who's crazy, growing 9 children in a community, being the first one who stood up to his father, making his father cry, everything has been an experiment. So when he's pushed around, even to this day, when things have changed so much, he's like, I'm done. Bring it on, tell everyone, and let's show everyone that how to make change happen. And that day, his frustration had come so far up that he couldn't help himself. And that's how I found out.
That's great. Well, I think that's a great note for us to say thank you again for coming out and speaking with us tonight. It's been really wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for coming.